Talk about incredible timing. We're here to discuss why it's important not to lose the contribution of girls and women to our real history in the United States. And in fortuitous timing, we're going to be sharing this episode today, which, if you're listening in real time, is shortly after President Biden stepped aside, not accepting the Democratic nomination, and instead getting behind his VP, Kamala Harris, our country's first female VP and first Asian and Black VP as well.
I think you're absolutely right. And today's episode is focused on acknowledging the contributions of people who created history, right? But who maybe came before those who we have commonly acknowledged to be those history creators. For example, today we're talking about someone who came before Ruby Bridges, which is who we all think of perhaps when we think of school integration. Because little did we know that back in 1868 in Iowa, there was a young Black teen who was actually the first known person to integrate a school. So what would happen if we all read our children books that included the story of people like Susie Clark? How would knowing about our country's real history with all its nuances, false starts, hope, and persistence change our understanding of where we are as a country today and what it really will take to move it forward into a more tolerant, accepting, integrative, supported, and, perhaps even most importantly, community-driven nation? Maybe it would teach us that history isn't linear, that backlashes do happen, but that the desire to fight is a sign that we all still hold on to hope, which is really what we need collectively right now.
Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha.
So I am super excited to have this conversation, not only because it contains a whole lot of stuff, but in particular parts of history that many of us may not know about, including some of us who are in this conversation right now. So to kick this off, could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. My name is Jocelyn Hickey Johnson. I'm also known as Ms. Rocky. I have a podcast as well, and it's called Rocky and Shaviva's North End Update Live. And we have guests from all around the city because I live on the north end of Waterloo, which is predominantly Black, and it's gotten a bad reputation because we had some bad actors, some shootings. And so Shaviva, my best friend, and I decided to talk about the good stuff that happens here. And there's so much good. Was also commissioned to write the Susie Clark book because of my experience in children's books. I wrote 2 children's books prior to this that focused on a family that was like my family growing up. My father was Black, my mother was white, and I never saw books that featured families like mine. So the first 2 books were actually stories about my children's life, everyday life, and it just showed the family bonded by love. Thank you guys so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. I mean, similarities between being biracial, having a podcast with your best friend, highlighting voices and narratives that aren't often in the mainstream media. To me, Sasha, you hinted at it when we opened this show, the episode, but until we got your team's email, I had never heard of Susie Clark. I had never heard that there was a girl who was 13 years old, right around the age of my kids right now, who, to our knowledge now, was actually one of the first people to integrate a school. And it was back in Muscatine, Iowa, way back in 1868. What is the importance of discussing girls and women like Susie Clark to not losing our real history in this country?
That is a great question, and thank you. It's so important to have Susie Clark doing what she did back in 1868, and that was right 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. KKK was on the horizon. It was a crazy time, and how important it is because little Black girls and little girls in general need to see that Black people have been making strides and contributions into American history, and to actually live in Iowa and to know this little girl that actually did this back in 1868 is something for all girls to know, that a lot of things can be done. If you have a 13-year-old, it's not easy to get them to do everything you'd like them to do. But still, when you see them do something and you feel like you've empowered them to be that brave, there's a great sense of accomplishment. And Black girls have to be encouraged as well, because throughout history, all Black people have had to be encouraged through the years, because some people actually bought into the fact of being inferior. And if there's anything at all left in the culture, I know that there's a lot of pride and there's ingenuity and creativity in feeding your children positive affirmations. So it's always important to know that the history of Black life in America, and to understand that a lot of times we need to be encouraged and uplifted. And that's everybody, but sometimes especially a Black person or a child.
I love that you shared that, because it really speaks to that power of representation. And when we highlight true stories, it really does have people connect to the humanity in not just this historic figure, but just all the things that we as individuals are able to do as well. This was in 1868. And when I think about school integration, I jumped to Ruby Bridges, which was in the 1960s. And in the South, that was in New Orleans, right? Like, we're talking different parts of the country. We're talking 100 years later, and we're still repeating what Susie Clark did back in the late 1800s. And so it says to me that change does not come easily. It does not come in a straight line, that history repeats itself. What are some of the other things we can learn from this?
Well, first of all, you mentioned Ruby Bridges, and Susie Clark's case was cited in Ruby Bridges. So, it was so important in that way. And also the fact that she did it almost 100 years prior tells you that progress takes time. And I think the grandmother in my story told Susie, progress takes time. It won't happen overnight. So, but she never imagined it would take almost 100 years to actually have, integration in schools, have Black kids and white kids go to school together.
Because here we are again. Now it's several years after George Floyd was murdered, and we're still grappling with those questions. And I'm sensing there was this huge drive into corporations, for example, we're going to make a change. We're going to have different approaches. And then now we're having this great rollback. And it feels like there's this push and pull that's constantly happening. And what should we take from it?
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned George Floyd, because we want to keep saying his name, because it was such an important time in American history. It's made a change, like you said, and I'm glad you're noticing the wave, because it's definitely happening. You see more Black people on TV, more representation in so many different ways. And I think that, like George Floyd's daughter said, my daddy changed the world, and he really did make a big difference. What we should learn from Susie Clark's story is not only that change doesn't come overnight, but sometimes it can be very painful. The story was lost because there was a fire in Susie Clark's town. And this is right after the Civil War and everything. So we can only imagine why they had a fire. Her dad rebuilt the house, and they had a different house that's still standing there now. So there was a lot of history lost. And like, you didn't know who Susie Clark was. Not very many people did, until it was uncovered by two women, and they kept petitioning the city council and people to actually recognize him, because he was also an ambassador. And he was just a very important man. And of course, the story came up. Let's see, he settled in Muscatine in 1842 at the age of 16. So Susie's daddy was a very prominent man. He was a barber, and he knew a lot of the higher ups. He knew some doctors and some lawyers. And so he kind of was able to kind of incorporate into their town. And is Iowa nice to an extent? And a lot of times I think Iowa was kind of naive and didn't really know, or didn't want to play into what was going on in the South. So I think there was a lot of nice white people, and with the Quakers and the Underground Railroad running through Muscatine and right along the river was a big help, I think, to having Black people be along the way to help Susie in her struggle.
I think that is really important, and a part, besides not knowing about Susie Clark, for example, I think a lot of us don't think about Iowa when we think about, right, the early equal rights or civil rights movement, or when you think about sort of that post-Civil War era, right? I think people think about, okay, well, when the South lost the war, they did a lot of this work and forget about what happened pretty much everywhere else. I think that that point about like strength of spirit and the just how, you know, challenging and resilient and all of those things that you have to be in order to kind of fight not only a legal battle, right, but also really for to be seen as equal and to actually be able to step into the rights that you should have had in the first place is, you know, that is such a difficult thing to do. And I think about that now when I think about, you know, we're kind of in like, I don't know, in unprecedented times, I think is such an overstated phrase, yet so true, right? Especially in 2024, when we're recording this, you know, we saw the Dobbs case happen, for example, which was something that, you know, I personally never thought I would see Roe v. Wade overturned in my own lifetime. And I know that that, you know, sentiment is shared by so many people. So, and I think then back to that, the point about resilience and strength and what you need to do to continue to fight. Like when you're thinking about Susie and when you're thinking about others and yourself, you know, doing this work and this conversations, and how do advocates continue to do this work despite, you know, being sort of faced with all these numerous challenges and that whole non-linear path of history?
It's a chore, to say the least. You know, I think anybody that's advocating for anything, you know that there are good people, and I do believe that there are more good people than bad, you know, or people with good intention. But not only we were talking about Susie, not only and her dad fighting the legal system, but just daily life. Being Black, a Black man who is considered what, 1/16th of a person or some nonsense, you know, and to hold his head up. Yes, there were nice people, but there were still the bad people, the bad players as well. So yeah, to be an advocate for justice and things that are right, it's tiring. Most people want to be kind, they just don't know how, because this book is geared toward first through fifth graders. And so to actually tone it down to a place where a child can understand that people are mean and still let them know that there is a resolve. You know, most people want to be kind, they just don't know how. And so hopefully they will understand. Maybe you can stop right there in that dialogue and talk to them about how they can be kind. But back to my point is a child is worth taking the time with. Sometimes grown-ups are not. You know, you have to want to know how much this person deserves to really get inside of you and understand what you're actually trying to convey to them, which is basically what you feel is common sense, you know, so.
Totally. You mentioned children, and I couldn't agree more. I think children have such a great sense of right and wrong, of justice, of curiosity, of kindness. Like they really do understand a lot more than the adults in our lives might give them credit for. So I'm curious, a lot of your books, they have been children's books. And why did you choose to make them? And also, it's the educators and adults and parents who bring books into children's lives, right? What are the roles that these adults in kids' lives can play in discussing stuff like racism and real history in a productive way that helps kids?
Well, thank you for saying that. The reason I chose children's books is because as a mom, my children loved to be read to. And like most children, you know, it's a time when you can kind of snuggle and get close and talk about the illustrations and actually share dialogue about good things, you know, that you want to share with them. I read this book the first time to my grandson. And when I got to the part, well, my family's always been multiracial. And so we have really dark skinned people in our family. We have very light skinned people in our family. And when I read the part where the teacher told Susie, you have to go home now, your skin is too dark. The teacher says, you must be Susie Clark. Please go home now, your skin is too dark. He stopped. This was the light skinned, one of the lighter skinned grandchildren. He stopped dead in the middle of the book, you know, because he's got cousins that have dark skin. And he was like, wait a minute, they said her skin was too dark. That's not very nice, you know. So it opened up the point where he didn't even want to go on any further till he figured out how are we going to get out of this, you know, and why would anybody even say such a thing? So that's when you can actually talk to them about sometimes people will find something that's different about you and not like it because it's not like them. And, and you can just tell them that they're wrong and that's, not the way you should feel. So I think that the book opens up a lot of opportunities for the children without pointing fingers. That's a big thing nowadays. We want our kids to know real history, but we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, right? So the way I came around that is that I don't, like in my first two children's book, I don't talk about race. I just, in the illustrations, it shows. And the illustration that points out that there was a white little boy that was being mean to Susie, and Susie was Black. And that's the only time that the child actually sees it. And you can just point that this is the little boy that was being mean to Susie. And I think he's saying, get out of my way. That's what he was saying to her on the playground. So they get the sense that this little boy was mean. And then at the end, it all comes together where all the children are playing together. And Susie Clark has a school named after her for all the efforts that she made in changing things.
I love that and I want anybody who's a parent, especially of a white presenting child, to hear it, because I have been on playgrounds where I have heard a white kid say, I can't play with you. Your skin is too dark. Like, it happens. Our kids notice difference, and you have to be ahead of it to make sure your kid is not the one thinking, because if you're letting the universe or what the media and everything that you're seeing out there shape your kids' opinions, think about what they're going to come out with, right? You want to be the one controlling the narrative and making sure you're talking about real history, real dynamics, and real challenges that people in this country face. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you. I think if you have children, if they're different in any way, that you will also know if they've had their feelings hurt. I know as a mother of Black children, I've always had to tell my kids what to look out for, because you can't prepare them. And it's sad that you have to try to explain to them that some people are going to make sure you know that you're different, and it might not be in a friendly way. So when you hate to send them out there in the world, but eventually it's going to happen, I remember my daughter once when I took her to a tennis lesson, and she was standing in line, and all the other girls were white, and my daughter is brown skinned Black girl, and two of the white girls in front of her said something that just really, I just saw her heart just drop while she was, I was sitting in the bleachers watching her. I'm like, wonder what they said to her, what they said or what she heard. And when she came back to sit by me, she said these two girls, she didn't know them at all, but she was saying, the two girls said to each other, how kids can talk, is like, gosh, what if you were Black? That's what they were saying. Just imagine if you were Black. And they said Black so dirty that she felt like it wasn't a good thing to be Black. And so, things like that, you can't prepare your children for. And it happens. It could be, if they're Asian, they can say something, what's different about, that child, or no matter what, kids are always going to find something. But I think the fact that this book brings Susie above the things that she was experiencing, it put her on a pedestal because of her bravery.
I think that's a really important thing to remember, right? And something that is really important to teach kids as well. Things are going to be hard and they're going to be really tough, but sometimes those things are also really, really worth it, not just for you per se, but for those who come after you, those who are influenced by you. And, I think adults could also obviously hear that message, but to the point that we were talking about with kids and fairness and having this deep-seated sense of equality, they are the ones that may hear it in a really different way. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of parents and educators who are really interested in getting this book, finding out more about you. Where can they do all of that?
Okay, I'm going to tell you that in just a second. One thing I wanted to say out about the book is that another thing about Black girls and Black kids is that I feel that they need to know more about Black culture before slavery, and so this book ties her to Africa because her grandmother was born enslaved. And so her grandmother has to tell her that she was sold when she was a child. So there's a lot of layers to this story. And then the true story of Susie Clark, and it tells a lot about her in the back of the book. So the StanleyCenter.org is where you can purchase the book at half price with the discount code is Muscatine at the StanleyCenter.org.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. We really, really appreciate it. And thanks for shining your light on this part of history that I did not know about. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. It's been a pleasure.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.